He's a mess.
That's his win.
He's a
Okay.
mess.
Um,
But we're fine. We're
all right, we're fine, we're good, we're starting.
Hello, hello.
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 And yes, for folks in the chat, COE credits does apply to remote participants. There's a form on the schedule page that you should be filling out with the little code words that we've been giving out. We'll give out a couple more of those in the middle of the session today. And those get emailed back to me along with the evaluation forms for credits for folks online. And we'll figure out how to get you your credit. All right, this is our last workshop session. And we've got about an hour and a half still to again, the idea has been throughout today, fewer presentation, more time for question and answer, and really thinking about how to turn this into practical next steps for folks. So we're going to start, however, with some very practical advice on how to turn this into actual policy advocacy by talking about what it looks like to do some good lobbying with our in-house experts, Francine and her partner Hans, who will be joining us shortly. And so I'm going to turn it over to Francine to talk about some lobbying 101.
All right, can you all hear me okay? Well, thank you for joining me. People often ask me what is lobbying. And when I tell people what a federal lobbyist does, it's usually trying to either get Congress to pass a law or not pass a law, get the administration to adopt a regulation or change a regulation or not adopt a regulation, or think about how they interpret that regulation. So that's sort of my nutshell of what lobbying is. When my kids ask me, what am I talking about today? I said, I'm talking about how to get people to do things you want them to do. That's actually what lobbying is. So that's really the theme of our discussion today, is how do we get people to do things we want them to do? And often it's, some people want to be helpful. There are other people that don't want to be helpful. How do we either get them over to our side, or how do we get them to at least not interfere with our side? Hey, Hans, come on in. Introduce my colleague, Hans Rickhoff. Yeah. Great. I was just giving them the overview of what lobbying is.
I want to hear this.
Right? Or as I simplified for my kids, it's the how to get people to do what you want them to do presentation. So that's what we're talking about today. So before I jump into the PowerPoint, Hans, why don't you introduce yourself real quick? Eric has already introduced me because I have worked with the Law Center for a number of years and spoke to them earlier yesterday. But Hans, why don't we give a quick dirty about you? Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for this opportunity. And thank you, Francine, and thank you, Eric, for the opportunity to visit today. And looking forward to this conversation. I hope this is more of a discussion and dialogue and a good opportunity to ask a lot of questions and have a back and forth. My name is Hans Rickhoff. I've been at the firm for about 12 years. Before that, I worked with two former members of Congress, one from Pennsylvania, one from Texas. And a million years ago, I worked in the state legislature back when it was Governor Bush, not President Bush, and had the pleasure of working with Francine on a number of issues and a number of clients, and spent a lot of time up on Capitol Hill engaging with members and staff, and also working with a number of clients to help them engage with members and staff to either promote legislation, stop legislation, socialize some other good ideas. But this is a really distinct privilege and pleasure. So thanks again for letting me be part of it.
Thank you, Hans. And as Hans mentioned, he has done some work at the state level too, where I know a lot of what you all are doing, maybe state advocacy. What we're going to talk about today really crosses state, local, federal, presidential, everywhere, anywhere. It's really just helping you get the tools to figure out your message, who you want to bring that message to, and how to most effectively carry that out to get to the point of accomplishing what your goal is. And one of the other things we'll talk about and maybe workshop a little bit is how to figure out your goal, because I know in the presentation yesterday regarding the video, there was some talk about, first of all, we need to all come to the same goal and figure out what it is we are actually looking to do. And that is sometimes the hardest part is, what is the end goal? So thinking about that as well. So let's talk first about policymaker outreach. And as I said, this will be the same across, the presidency all the way down to your local dog catcher who may actually have a role in some of the work we do. It is their job to listen to you. You are the constituent. You are their customer. You are the most important person to them. You have to remember that and think about how empowered you are. And we just saw in the election how people can be empowered. So think about that when you're going in.
Sure. And when you think about you as their constituent, that enables you to have an immediate and direct connection with them, because you're either from their state, from their district, from their neighborhood, and that makes you have that connection. One thing I highly suggest, and just in terms, and I know we're going to go over some do's and don'ts, was ensure that this is the right member that you're talking to, and that you do live in that district, because they'll probably say, hey, where do you live? You say, well, I live, on, Peachtree Road. And they're like, well, that's not in my district. And so then all of a sudden.
But maybe you work in their district.
maybe
you shop in their district.
Yes.
You've got some connection.
Yeah, some connection, but no, it's an easy process to go to. There's a great website that helps you kind of show both who your federal legislators are, who your state legislators are, and to Francine's point, all the way down to dog catcher. But yes, absolutely. It's an intimidating process a lot of time to go into these buildings, to go into these offices and go through this process, but recognize at the end of the day, all elected officials, unless they're retiring, want one thing, and that's to be reelected. And you guys all have the power to vote for them. So they do want to hear from you, and they do want to be responsive.
Yeah. And we found that meetings, virtual or in person, are really the most effective way to inform and influence policymakers or their staff. And I do tell particularly our clients when they come up through Washington, D.C., don't be concerned that you might be meeting with a staffer who might, look like they're younger than your own children, that they have no experience, they don't know what they're talking about. That might all be the case, but eventually that staffer may work his or her way up. That staffer may take your issue and run with it. And that staffer, deserves the same respect you would expect, them to give you. But lots of times, lots of discretion and responsibility is given to very, very junior people. My younger brother used to work for a member of the Louisiana State House, and he joked that he was her chief of staff. He was also her only staff member. So maybe he was the chief of staff. He also was her driver, and everything in between. You just don't know. And he was also very young when he did this. And so you might have met him and like, who is this guy? Why am I telling him my story? Because he's going to have the ear of that member. So, remember that the staff are also, the closest to the member. They're very important to meet with, and they're also going to be the ones that are going to dig into the issues. I know Hans has worked with many members of Congress who have, they often say, okay, yeah, talk to my staff about that. Yeah, I want to be helpful. Tell my staff what I need to do, because they don't have the time necessarily to do it all. But once they've given that signal and that green light to the staff, you really do want to make that connection.
Sure, and also recognize the staff is very busy. They're working on issues, from a wide and diverse kind of area set. And so when you talk about your issue, make sure you talk about it, from the standpoint, ask them the question, how much do you know about this issue? So you can kind of understand and level set. A lot of these younger staffers, despite thinking they know everything, they don't know everything, and they do want to be educated. They do want to know what you're talking about. So I think Francine brings up an excellent point. While the staff may appear young, they're all very smart for the most part. They're all very talented. And to her other point is the members themselves give a lot of discretion and latitude and responsibility to those staffs to help them make decisions. So even if you are meeting with staff and they appear young, take it seriously and recognize the important role they play in this process.
Yeah. And then the other thing I'll say too is that I don't want to say anyone is inexperienced, but we're all inexperienced in something. And no matter who you meet with and how long they've been around, policy and politics, they don't have the experience you have. And that's why they turn to us. So, there were about 15 or so years ago, Obama's running for president. And he's, I'm not going to take money from lobbyists. I'm not going to get influence from lobbyists. And I'm like, well, actually, some of us lobbyists know more about the issues than some of your staff, because we've lived and breathed these issues for so long. So remember that you have experience that the policymakers and the staffers don't have. And it doesn't mean they're inexperienced in what they work on. They just don't work on your issues day in and out. And that's where your experience can really help frame the issue for them. So keep that in mind as well. So in terms of actually lobbying, and I have some more greater detail, we'll go into this later on in the presentation, but
the first thing to do is, like I said, determine your goal. What is it you want to do? We want to end homelessness. Okay, but we got to drill down a little bit on that, because you can't just have a very lofty goal with no specificity. Because many of us want to end homelessness. We got to figure out, well, what's the best path to that? What is our issue? What's our desired solution? We have an end game of no more homelessness, but what do we do to get there? Maybe we want to change how people are treated. Maybe we want to get more housing. We have to think about what is the actual solution.
Yeah, no. So a lot of these meetings, while they may be new to you, they're not new to the staff and members. And in large part, they can be kind of formulaic in terms of how they work. You know, we start with what the issue is, but in every meeting, either the member or the staff, they're all waiting for one thing, and that's the punchline or the ask, or what is the request? What do you need at the end of the day? And to Francine's point, you know, what is the desired solution? And when you think about it, the desired solution, you want to think at it through the lens of what makes sense, what's
What can be
politically,
done?
what's politically achievable, yes, what can be done, and does it fit within where this representative or the staff or, you know, jurisdiction, and also their thought process on other issues. So yeah, so that's just something to be prepared for. Every office, they may even stop you halfway through the meeting and say, okay, so what do you guys really want at the end of the day?
Or what they often say is, what's the fix?
Yeah.
And when we say we want to end homelessness and someone says, what's the fix? I don't think we have a good answer to just that. So we need to get a little more specific on what we want to do. So identifying your audience, this is really important. Researching who has influence or jurisdiction over the policy you're trying to impact, or those policymakers who have an interest in your issue, even if no direct oversight or jurisdiction. For many, local officials, they should all have an interest in it because they're local officials and there's homelessness in their community, full stop. We don't need to bring it up anymore, right? That's not always the case though. You do have some who, don't have homelessness, or they're not interested, or they're not personally tied to it. But then you have some others, and you've identified them who are more interested in it. So our new LA mayor, one of her first top issues she ran on was homelessness. Well, I think we're going to be reaching out. What do you think? Right? So you rank and you prioritize that outreach.
The only thing I'll add there is, they don't have to sit on the committee of primary jurisdiction. They don't have to have made a lot of remarks related to homelessness or to the issues that we're bringing to them. But if there is a connection there, you want to make sure you know what that connection is in advance so that you can help identify that and they recognize how well they've done their homework, or you served with Ms. Bass in a previous administration. I think you could be a good conduit to getting this information to her.
Yep. So preparing for your outreach, this is really where the rubber hits the road. Messaging. So what the advocates will say to connect with and persuade the audience. We just talked for a minute about figuring out who your audience is and what may matter to them. But this is really, again, when I go back to my joke about with my kids, getting people to do what you want them to do. How are you going to connect with them and persuade them and then have them take action? So how are you going to get them to understand the issue, to then take your side on the issue, and then act on the issue?
Yeah, and the other thing I just kind of recognize here is that not everything's going to be accomplished in one meeting. It's going to be a process, and we'll talk about that process kind of post-meeting. We're talking about kind of how to prepare for the meeting, but recognize that this is not going to be the only time you're going to interface with them, and you want to continue to be a resource and help moving forward. So I just want to kind of note that.
And another area that we're going to talk to and sort of get into deeper discussion on in a little bit is adapting your message. So not having an inconsistent message, but adapting and tailoring your message depending on the audience. So yesterday there was discussion of moving this from a charity discussion to a civil rights discussion. There's also an economics discussion. And thinking about who your audience is. Is there an audience that will be most interested in the cost of not addressing homelessness, rather than the charitable side of it or the civil rights side of it? Well, then we have a slightly different message for that person. It doesn't mean that our messages related to charity and to civil rights are not ones we still hold true to. But if there are some that are more driven by economics than civil rights, you tailor that message. You're not betraying our overall message, but you're tailoring it and you're meeting them where they are and talking to them about what matters to them, what's going to get them to take action for you. So preparing for outreach, this is actually a really fun one because it's thinking about how are we actually going to do our outreach. We talked earlier about meetings. Those are so important, but that is not the only tool. And sometimes you don't have access to that tool. Sometimes people are hard to meet with, sometimes they won't meet with you. So what other tools are there? So preparing for our outreach, we want to think about our assets. So the channel advocates can tap to deliver your message. You sometimes have internal assets like legislative relationships, a grassroots network, or funding for advertising. And then you have partner networks and other relationships. Maybe there is somebody that is closer to the elected officials and the policymakers than you are that cares about your issue. Can you tap into them? Can they become an advocate that you work together with? Is there somebody that, is a local sports star whose family member had a relationship with homelessness? Can that person, help talk to the mayor? Figuring it out and making those connections is really important.
Yeah, I mean, when you go in there and you're delivering your message, you always want to have, some, to the extent possible, some sort of third-party validator. I'm not the only one saying this. I don't know if you've seen this article in this recent press. They're also saying this. Also these other members, or my other colleagues have been an echo chamber on this. There's other stakeholders that are saying the same thing, and being prepared that way. I think that helps members recognize that this is an issue that's broader than just maybe your concern.
Then we talk about the strategy activities. So what advocates will actually do to carry the message to the audiences. I know there's a wonderful movie coming out. That's one of the great ways we can do that. There's other ways too. There are websites, there's social media. You all have a voice thanks to social media. There's citizen digital reporters, there's personal visits, as we talked about. There's writing, faxing, calling, emailing legislators. I don't know how much faxing we do anymore, but it can be done. There's testifying before a legislative committee. I think there are some folks in this room who would be wonderful to testify in front of a committee if you're comfortable doing that, talking about solutions, talking about the problem, but also the solutions. And there's talking with the media. The media is a really strong tool. You need to bring that out. And I know it was discussed yesterday as well that, when John Lewis was crossing the bridge and that got played in people's homes, that began to move the needle. So the media, we have to be very careful when dealing with the media to make sure it's the media that you are happy with, that they're going to frame this in the right way and that we're going to get our issues in front of them in a positive way, as opposed to just talking about a problem, but let's talk about solutions. But there are lots of different ways to carry the message and strategic activities you can engage in. The next thing we always talk about is the timeline, and that is not always up to us. And I tell my clients that all the time, right, Eric? That's not up to me. I don't know when that bill's going to get passed. I mean, you tell me. But what is your timeline to meet your objectives? What should you be considering? Is there an election? Should this happen before or after the election? Would it help the member if they helped you with this now, or would it hurt the member? Sometimes they say, we're going to hold off. We're not going to vote on this. There's a good example from yesterday, I think, where the Senate passed a marriage equality bill that some members said, I don't want to vote on this before the election, but I will vote on it after the election. Okay, we take it where we can. But thinking through what are the different action forcing events, and then legislative meetings. So Hans, this might be a good chance for you to talk about how states sometimes don't meet as often as others.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great point. And Francine also brought up another good point in terms of testifying. So a lot of states, you're allowed to testify, whether you're being called to testify or not. Usually when you're called to testify before Congress, you do it. And it's a privilege if you're called and you're required to do it. It's not so much of a privilege. It's not so much of something you want to do. But when it comes to individual states, a lot of times you can literally go when they're considering a bill, put your name on the list, and wait your turn to testify. Usually it's limited somewhere between 2 and 5 minutes to that testimony. It's also a great exercise because you get to hear what other people are saying. You get to hear maybe what different sides of each parts of the issue. And then there's a number of states, to Francine's point, that don't meet continuously all year round like the federal government does. The legislature I worked in Texas meets once every 2 years for about 5 months, and they get all of their activity done then. So going back
Don't miss the boat.
So going back to the timeline, like if you're not in an odd numbered year and it's between January and May, then the legislators, well, that sounds like an interesting idea. Why don't you come back in January or May?
And then, but on
May.
top of that,
Yeah.
they also have like a drop date where the bills have to be dropped, right? And then there's all these things within the legislature which you're going to want to get to know, where if the bill isn't introduced by a certain time, it's hard to then get it considered. And I know in Maryland, they've got like a cutoff date for that. And then, the next session is a year later and they'll look at it again, but you do want to know what are your timelines? And then you can sort of backdate from that. So if you're looking to the next Texas legislature, and when is that, Hans? Or is that happening now?
No, so they just started allowing bills to be introduced, and it starts in January. So that's a great example. And then, but you're right, they cut off the ability to introduce bills, they cut off the consideration of bills. You need to make sure that that bill is going to be considered by the committee. The different committees that control kind of the timeline and schedules, they have rules committees, they have legislative calendar committees. And so all of that's part of the process. That's getting a little bit in the weeds.
But let's say you want it done by the end of this Texas state legislature, you need to get it introduced pretty soon.
Yeah, yeah, and you need to start building support for it now. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So when you do have meetings, as we talked about, the policymaker meetings are really one of the top ways you can influence. I think also these rules would apply to when you're testifying, especially when you are self-selecting to testify. When you stand in the line at the local town meeting and you want to testify, there's 5 rules we have. Be professional, be prepared, be polite, be punctual, and do not be political. And that even goes down to saying, I voted for you, you should do X, Y, and Z. Because if you don't say it to the next person, they might realize, okay, well, you know, he or she didn't say it to me, so they probably didn't vote for me. Why are we even putting whether I voted for you really on the table during this meeting or during this testimony? We also like to say that good communication is going to cut through the clutter and not add to it. So when you are up there, you know, not only being professional, prepared, polite, and punctual and not political, you want to cut through the clutter. You want to just come in and give them exactly what you need to know with the right message and the right medium delivered by the right messengers to the right audience. So thinking about who your audience is when you're giving that your quick statement. And again, maybe a little bit after we finish the formal presentation, we can talk a little bit about elevator pitch, how to really hone that message down depending on your audience. But it's important to really walk away with these 4 Ps minus the do not in terms of professional, prepared, polite, punctual, and not political.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you're building a relationship and you want it to be a positive relationship. You're not going in there with demands. You're going in there, you're being courteous of their position as the elected official, and recognize that most of these elected officials, not necessarily all the staff, want to be liked and are likable people, and so they want to have a conversation. So it makes it a little bit easier to have some of those conversations.
Sure. So some do's and don'ts. So you got the meeting, you're going in, you're preparing for it. There's a couple of things you might prepare in terms of materials, a 1-page fact sheet I often look at, or a white paper, which is longer information. You want the information you prepared to be something they can digest, but also provide perhaps the background behind it. So that way they know you're supported. You're not just making statements. You're not saying, you know, every person on the streets costs us $10 million a year. If we just build housing, we'd be okay. Well, I don't know if it's really 10 million. So maybe let's get down to like the actual numbers and some backup for that. But it isn't, you know, it's important to have your papers with you and be prepared to talk about the facts. So our do's and don'ts. Number 1, have a positive attitude. Listeners respond favorably to friendly meetings. It does not mean that this person will be your friend or that you will be their friend. You may be adverse to one another, but still have a positive attitude at the meeting.
Yeah, I think having a positive attitude, going in there and not assuming that they know, number 1, anything about you or anything about the issue. I have a lot of don'ts, like don't use acronyms. I mean, like make a connection, like, because a lot of times they're like, okay, they'll have, if it's a good staffer and they're prepared before the meeting, the staffer or the member will have some idea of why you're coming in. They'll have some idea of what your request is going to be. But do give them the background and do have a positive attitude. And I think one of the big don'ts I remember I had a client, they were a foreign client, and they came in and they started the meeting. I have 4 demands. We have 4 requests. So I think you just need to remember that this is an opportunity for you to.
Yeah, it doesn't work with my kids either.
Yeah, no, it's not with mine either. But yeah, I think that's having a positive attitude, recognizing that you're trying to promote something and you want them to listen, and they're in a position to help you.
And then offering yourselves and others that you're aware of in the community as resources on issues that are important to us, I think is a really key piece, because as I said earlier, they don't have the experience you have. They don't have the resources or even know who they can get information from that you might know. And so one of the things that they really appreciate is if you say to them, this is, let's continue the conversation. We are a resource if you get questions about this. If you see bills that attempt to overcome some of these issues, feel free to reach out to us and we can give you our opinion on them. So make it a back and forth, and offering yourselves as a resource is a great way to build a relationship and a rapport that will move you towards getting our goals. Thanking them for the opportunity and conveying your views, to convey your views, being gracious also goes a very long way. They have lots and lots going on. The time they take is time they're not doing something else. It is the same for you, of course, but this is your issue, not theirs. And so it is going to be important that they know that you appreciate the time. And make a note of and respond with any follow-up needed from the meeting. It's so important to do follow-up. We do Hill days sometimes, and trade associations will bring people in, and there'll be all these great meetings. 52 meetings today, and you're like, great, but what's the follow-up? What's the next step? And if there is a next step, make sure that if you have follow-up, you do it. If they have follow-up, remind them to do it. Because they might have said, oh yeah, there was a great article on this. I don't remember where it was, but I'll find it and send it to you. It's a great opportunity for you to actually send a note saying, hey, it was so great to meet with you. And you mentioned the article by Hans. Would you forward that on to me? And now you've continued the conversation. Rather than you went in, you had your 20-minute meeting and you left, and they forgot about you because they had 5 more meetings that day. And it's not their fault and it's not your fault. And you were compelling, but you've got to raise yourselves up into their memory bank.
Yeah, I mean, it also goes to just do be prepared, but don't worry if you don't have all the answers. I think a great way, to Francine's point about following up, is if you don't know the answer, say, just be upfront with that. I don't know the answer to that, but I will get you that answer. And it's a good way to demonstrate.
That is a great way,
that
actually. Sometimes I
you're a good
pretend I don't
researcher.
know something, so I have an excuse to email them later.
Yeah. But yeah, so I don't think they're expecting you to know everything. They are expecting you to be prepared. But if you don't know an answer, it is, to Francine's point, it's a really great way to follow up with a number of other things. It shows that you can be a resource moving forward too.
Another thing I always like to tell people is do not assume there's only one side to the issue. Now, this is a hard one, right? Because how can there be another side to tackling homelessness? Like, how can there be another side? But again, that's the big issue. What about the little things we're trying to do? Is there another side to the little things you're trying to do? I always like to figure out what is the other side, because I've had staff ask me before, okay, great, but who's going to be mad at my boss if they do this? And you know what? You're a very effective lobbyist if you're able to tell them who's going to be mad and how they are wrong. If you say, I don't know, everybody supports this, and then they find out later, there's some opposition, then I think you lose some credibility and you have not advanced your cause. But if you say to them, yeah, okay, so the, local bid is going to have a problem with this for these 3 reasons, but here's why they're wrong. And we're going to meet with them and we're going to share that with them. And we hope to bring them over to our side. They see you've thought it through. So you're not setting them up to get yelled at by somebody, and you're being honest. And again, I don't know that it's easy to identify who's against solving the problem of homelessness, but who might be against our specific ask. So I want to build a new affordable housing unit, affordable housing project or development. Don't like to use the word project, a development, over on this part of town. Well, who's going to be mad if we do that? Well, the neighbors might be mad. They're wrong to be mad. And I can tell you that, they shouldn't be mad. And we've been meeting with them and this, that, and the other. You know what? The people on the other side of town might be mad too, because they'd like more development. This is a beautiful new building we're putting up. And actually, these guys could be mad too. So let's talk about all the people that can be mad and who's going to be jealous of who actually gets this development. We've turned it around and now all of a sudden people want this thing, right? That's a totally different conversation. But I have said to them, I've thought this through. Here's who's going to be angry. And who also might be mad? The people that want to turn the housing into market rate. Well, how about we do mixed use? I mean, there's lots of different solutions. Or you can say, you know what, there's market rate down the block. And we need affordable housing right here so people can live where they work. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to spin it around, but you do need to not assume there's only one side to your issue, because somebody else is probably coming in. And we know that there are people coming in trying to push back on housing first. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of dealing with those things. But, there are other sides to our issue, even though we don't want to think about them, we need to think about them. Our next one is don't necessarily expect to win the office over the office in the first meeting. So yes, we like to take yes for an answer. We like to walk away with, yeah, of course they signed on to my bill. They're introducing it. They're running with it. That's not always going to happen. This is a dialogue. So don't expect to win them over necessarily in the first meeting. Little baby steps are great. Another thing that, I tell people is you need to have your expectations in check, and maybe it's just keeping them out of the discussion. Right now there's the movement to push back on housing first. Is there a way to go in and say, well, here's why you shouldn't adopt this bill? So actually, in my mind, Hans, you might agree, a lot easier to kill something than have something.
Yeah.
So maybe that's your goal for this year, to not move backward. Doesn't mean we can't also have some goals to move forward, but first we got to not move backward. So thinking about that, and one step in not moving backward is to stop people who might want to move that way by identifying for them why it would be bad to move that way. So it's really easy to ask someone to not do something. I can get my kids to not do lots of things. Not everything, but lots of things. But it's sometimes you have to think again, is like, what is my actual goal? And is this someone I'm just trying to neutralize? That's what we often call it. We're trying to neutralize somebody who could be swayed the other direction by very powerful forces. Well, you're more powerful, go in and sway them first. And then we also, as we said earlier, don't mention campaign contributions or the next election. It's
Yeah.
bad form and actually up on the Hill illegal. So if you're in a congressional office, you actually are not allowed to talk about campaign contributions in the office. So well, that's our formal presentation. I know I mentioned that we would talk about adapting messages to different contexts, but I did want to start by opening up if there are questions or if you want us to jump right into what I've got in terms of adapting. Yes.
I guess this is kind of in relation to adapting for the context. And I don't know if a lot of other people have been feeling this way the last few days, but a lot of, I think, the legal organizations here are direct service organizations, and so we get funding from the Legal Services Corporation. Do you guys have any advice on kind of the workaround of LSD rules when it comes to lobbying? They're pretty strict. I mean, obviously, if we look at things, it's very intentional so that legal aid lawyers not like mobilized in a meaningful way. But you guys seem like experts, so if you have any tips or tricks, I would love to hear it.
No, I'll let you take
Oh. Well, first off, it's great to be aware of what your rules are, because you don't want to get yourselves in trouble. I think some of it is considering what hat you're wearing at what time. Are you doing this in your official capacity or personal capacity? And what are you doing? What are you allowed to do? And so I don't know your exact rules, but we do have some folks in-house that would probably help navigate that. So I would say if you don't know them, get advice in terms of what exactly you can do. What's always interesting too, and I find myself nervous about running afoul of this sometimes, some of the restrictions I have, is, when you've got that relationship with somebody, because, your kids play soccer together, or you see them in the grocery store, because again, local officials are kind of different from federal officials. You might bump into them more. Is it okay to tell them what you're working on? Is it okay to tell them what's on your mind? I would say almost always yes, and I encourage that. I encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities. It's, what's been keeping you busy, or open the door so maybe they can ask you the same thing. Ask them like, Congresswoman so-and-so, local Congresswoman so-and-so, what's been on your mind? What have you been working on? Oh, she'll tell you, X, Y, and Z, and she might turn back, what have you been working on? Well, then all of a sudden you're able to say, I'm really concerned about how we're treating, homeless in this and this way. Have you now violated your rules? Well, we'd want to double check and not do that if you would. But sometimes that opportunity is there, and it is really hard to not just jump right in. Yeah,
Go
you
ahead,
probably know the rules.
Well, I mean, a trick that we've used at conferences such as this one in the past is invite them to speak on a panel. And then, they speak for 5 minutes with their expertise on whatever issue it is. And then they sit there for 90 minutes and listen to you, to the people in the room, talk about the issue. And this is particularly true for, this is how we built support for the human right to housing. Over the past 15 years since I've been doing this. I invited people from HUD, from DOJ, from USICH elected officials to come and sit on panels with me where, I framed the issue up. They heard from people, their constituents, who were talking about their issues framed as human rights issues. And none of it was lobbying, but it was longer than an average, 20-minute meeting that you would get with a staffer. And often, if you target the staffers, the staffers don't often get to be the front, the speakers on issues, but they're even more often the experts than their bosses are. So you can get them in, and it can be a really powerful way to just do it once, do it twice, do it another time. So much of this, as they were saying, it's all about relationship building, all about following up, and those repeat interactions. They're not gonna necessarily get it the first time, but the third time they're on the panel, they're like, oh yeah, I remember this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden it's in their head, and they've been influenced and they don't even realize it.
No, Eric, I think you hit it. I mean, there are rules and regulations related to advocacy and lobbying when it comes to not-for-profits and how you're organized. But always your First Amendment right to petition the government to redress your grievances. So, going through that lens, in terms of your personal capacity, I don't think there's a lot of, or any limitations to promoting this. But to Francine's point, you should always be aware of the rules. And I loved how Eric framed it in terms of there's still other avenues and opportunities to get to the same thing, in terms of advocacy.
Yeah, and you could organize, as we were saying in one of the earlier sessions, like a people's tribunal, where other people are going to do it. You can be part of the organizing of the events, but you're not doing the lobbying yourself, kind of that sort of thing. Did you have a?
I actually have an answer to the.
All right.
Yeah. No, you guys are doing great. This is just, I had someone who has worked with LSA courts, we work around. So number one is the exception is a written invitation to appear. So work with folks like me on the ground who have relationships with the members. It doesn't have to be the chairperson, it could be another member. Get your written invitation, exception met. Second, you can always educate in your personal capacity and professional, just focus on the impact. Do not ever make the leap to lobbying. Never say the legislature should do X to correct this. Never list of demands. The third is be a media source. You can answer all day long the impact of your clients, right? I go to court and lobby these, not lobby, I go to court and litigate these issues. Sorry, I'm both a lobbyist and a lawyer. And then last and finally is connect direct impacted people to go testify themselves. And those are 4 workarounds for you.
Thank you.
Woo. Yeah.
Crowdsourcing.
We have more questions, otherwise I can move us into sort of our adapting messages discussion.
So, yeah, so my name is Robert Warren, and I've been working with an organization called Fairness Coalition for like the last 14 years. And we're headed by individuals who have actually experienced homelessness. And we call them experiences, I guess. And so we've had this, belief that housing is human rights for the last 14 years, as we've been, people experiencing homelessness. And we actually came up with what we thought was a solution, a public policy. And we tried to form a ballot initiative. And that ballot initiative was based on if an individual earned under $39,000 a year, he would receive some form of LSP housing voucher, which would allow him to pay 1/3 of what HUD say is affordable as far as which you pay for rent. And the problem that I have with, a lot when we have these hearings, these sessions about housing as a human rights and, and right to housing and so forth and so on, it's like we never have what that policy is. What we're asking for. And this is what just bothers me, I just don't understand. I mean, because it's not really rocket science to me, I mean, if we have determined that, people who are fixed income should be able to get some form of housing voucher or housing assistance, then if they qualify for it, they should get it. that's the policy. I mean, that's the lobby. I mean, you know, why we act like we don't know what it is that we want? And I think that's where people get confused at, where people don't understand, you know what I'm saying? Cause I mean, I've served these encampments for the last 2.5 years. It's been very traumatizing for me to go through that and see people living in these encampments. But I also understand business community members and public community members not being able to have their parks no more. Not being able, you know, they're the people that come visit their businesses, not want to visit their business, see tents all around where they're at. So, you know, I mean, well, I just don't understand.
Yeah, no, and I think you actually help make the case as to why the community should come together to solve this, right? I don't think anybody is happy either living in a tent or having a tent in their park. So let's overcome that. And you've identified one potential tool to do that. And that's what I was talking about earlier is we need to have a specific action item. And that I think might take us actually to our planning activity if you all would like to do it. It's a planning chart we put together. You can also just take them with you, but it's figuring out your goal, your objectives. So what do you want to do? We want to get people a place to live. Well, how do we do that? We need to provide a voucher, provide some form of funding. We also have to have the housing available. This is one of the challenges we have too, right? You have people with vouchers they can't use. Well, we can't just say, oh, well, let's build some more housing. Let's buy a hotel that's not being used. Let's figure it out, hotel or motel, you know, find a way to overcome the problem. But part of it is on all of us to come up with those solutions. So our goals, we have a couple of,
One more
Go ahead,
thing, John. I mean, you know, we have an organization that has identified 17,000 vacant units here in this district. And that's supposed to be a healthy rental market. These are class A units. That's not available while we have folks, we're averaging like 50 to 60 people die every year out on the streets in this district. I mean, it's just so unacceptable.
absolutely. And so this, what is your solution is to give them to pass a law to get a voucher? Or you had a,
I mean, if you say people have a right to housing, you know, for me, it's a rush equity issue. I believe that folks up there in economic discriminated against when it comes to accessing housing.
Yep.
That's affordable, accessible, and sustainable to them. I mean, so if you're being discriminated against, if you're making, you have, the minimum wage is $15 an hour. And the rent costs you more than, you know, what you're making. Then, you know, you've been discriminated against.
Yeah.
When it
Yeah.
comes to your ability to access housing.
absolutely. No, agreed. And I think that this is where we drill down and we say, housing is a human right, but how do we get the housing to people? How do we get people in housing? And that's where the specific action items have to come in. So one of the things we talk about is, and we do this with clients all the time, we say, okay, what are our goals? What are the specific things? How are we going to get people into the housing? And we've got some good ideas and it can be more than one. We don't have to just have one idea and run with it, but we got to coalesce behind the ideas. And, you know, if we have to prioritize, we prioritize, but what are our specific objectives? And then what's our timeline? Who are we going to talk to about those? What assets can we use? What groups can help us do this? Maybe it is the people that actually are the homeowners around the park. The homeowners around the park also would like access to their park again. Do they want, you know, people who are in the tents just move to the next town over? Well, that's not really a solution, is it? So what can we do to get them to agree that we want to all chip in? We want to provide housing, not just move people, but provide housing. Are they an asset to us? And then what are our strategic activities to actually do this? So are we going to get legislation introduced? Are we going to, you know, go to the media? What are our specific strategic activities that we are going to engage in to get this across the finish line? And that's an activity or that's something we can sort of actively go through together today. If we want to think through how would we do this? And it's also something I, you know, suggest in all of your work that you take it with you. You take these concepts with you. So rather than say, we need everyone to agree that there's a human right to housing. Okay, well, that's step one. But then how do we fulfill that promise of a human right to housing?
Yeah.
Even if we all agree that there's the right, we haven't done anything yet to get the housing.
And I'll just say that, like, in terms of that how do we get there? That was part of some of what we talked about this morning. There are multiple ways to get there. There's public housing, there's vouchers, there's renter's tax credit. All of those are ways of addressing the affordability issue. All of them have like assets, drawbacks. It could be universal basic income, increasing SSI, SSDI payments for some people. You can address affordability either on like the housing cost side of the issue or on the income side of the issue. So making sure everybody has, raise a livable wage that's actually, allows them to afford housing. People who are on SSI or SSDI, getting them, making sure that their payments are keyed to the actual local housing costs, or a renter's tax credit, a homeowner's tax credit, these sorts of things that would take it off of the discretionary side of the budget and put it on the mandatory side of the budget, so that would actually get out to everybody. So there's a lot of ways of getting there, and with pros and cons, but I think it's important that those answers come from each community. It might not look the same for every community. We have some thoughts on how to do it at the federal level, to really make a huge difference across the country, but we also need people trying different things across the country. So first you get that agreement that housing is a human right, and then here's the voice of the people telling you this is what we need in our community on how to make it actually, how to operationalize it for DC. Here in DC, because our housing stock is this way, because these are our other limitations, here's the solution that's actually going to work in DC.
No, I think that's a great point. The solutions for Washington DC are going to be entirely different than for some rural communities that may be facing the same issues. And so, especially when these state legislatures, there's not a one solution for everything. So it is something that is part of the process Francine is putting together, or something may work really well in Washington DC, but may not work well in Birmingham or some of the suburbs there. But on the federal level, I know you guys are working on a number of things, and legislators like to hear a consistent message. To the extent that there can be a consistent message from all those stakeholders is very, very helpful.
And so at the federal level, we're working in partnership with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Center for Supportive Housing, all these other groups, to come up with a common vision for what it means to actually, make housing a human right, do housing justice, and what those concrete policies are going to be. There was a lot of hope when Build Back Better was a possibility, that we could, originally it was going to push towards universal vouchers, and then it kind of got scaled back, but to a dramatic expansion of vouchers, and then the whole thing fell apart because of Joe Manchin. But we figured out that some of these other mechanisms might be better in the long term, but housing vouchers are something that our government already knows how to do. If we could get that funded through this big infrastructure bill, then that was the difference that we could make right now. And so there's some strategic decisions there, and we were making sure that it was going to be not just vouchers for anybody, but it would start off being tailored to the people with the very lowest income. So it would be targeted towards people experiencing homelessness first, and then towards, everybody who needs a voucher should get one, but we could build in some of those mechanisms. So yeah, there are definitely plenty of thoughts on what those things should be, and there may be some that are the right thing for that time that aren't ultimately the right thing forever, but we can at least take advantage of that moment. And with that, I want to share our first code word for online attendees is vision. So having the right vision.
I love it. I think part of your vision too is also envisioning what can be done. We often sit down with our clients and say, what would you like to do this year, right? We're sort of in that planning stage for 2023 now. So our clients, it's a big trade association and they've got 10 priorities. Okay, let's look at those priorities and figure out on our little grid here,
what's most important to us and what's most likely to get done and where do they meet? You know, sometimes you take just the low hanging fruit because you might as well take your wins where you can, but what else can we reach for? But what do we think really can't be done and where are we spinning our wheels? And so maybe a, you know, universal basic income is not something that's going to happen in the next Congress, but we might get more low income tax credits available to build more units and more vouchers to go with those units because you're going to have a different response to that. So we again examine what do we want to get done and what do we think we can get done. It doesn't mean limiting ourselves to what, you know, is the easiest to get done, but having that hard discussion with ourselves too, I think is often important.
Sorry, keep jumping in.
No, please.
We do need to be thinking about what our ultimate goal is, what our vision of housing justice actually looks like, because we live far, far, far from that world right now. And so we've got to make sure that our interim steps aren't actually taking us further away from that goal, even if they do some immediate harm reduction. There is a role for harm reduction. But we want to make sure that we're not, you know, if our ultimate goal is to make sure that all people are adequately housed, we can't throw formerly incarcerated people under the bus to get there. And say, we're going to create this new voucher program, but it's going to exclude those people who some people don't like, you know, like that's we need to make sure our messaging emphasizes, you know, the humanity of all, and so that it's going to build towards that long-term goal for us, because otherwise we're doing our movement as a whole harm. And some a couple of weeks ago, we were doing kind of a visioning session with many of the national housing and homeless advocacy organizations, and somebody framed it really well. Like, the vision for what housing justice, what housing as a human right actually looks like, maybe we can't even picture it right now, because it's like this butterfly, and right now we're looking at a caterpillar, and like, how do you even see in that caterpillar what the butterfly will actually look like at the end of the day? It's really hard for us if we haven't seen that butterfly before, and we don't have the right to housing in this country. So, you know, we need to look at, you know, really think about what that butterfly should look like, and then what are the steps that are going to take us closer and closer, that, you know, as Francine was saying, kind of are achievable now, while we also work for that long-term vision.
So let's just envision that we have figured out what our goals are, that we have come together, all the housing advocacy groups gotten together and they put their top 3 things for 2023 on the board, and we want to move forward with them. So I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about how you create the message to frame those now identified goals, which are not quite identified yet. So we always want to ask these 4 questions when you are creating a message. And this is really for anything you're doing. What is the point? Why does it matter? What are you offering? And what do you want your audience to do? Going back to that ask.
So I think those are 4 great points. And I think that the last one is really important, because everyone is going to be waiting to say, well, what do you need me to do? What is at the end of the day that I can do to be helpful, move this forward? And before you make that request, you know, we talked about this throughout the presentation, you want to make sure it's something that they're hopefully going to be receptive to, and that they can actually do from both a political standpoint and from, you know, the perch that they're sitting on. You know, a lot of members may not sit on the committee of jurisdiction, they may not chair that committee, they may have no control over that timetable we were talking about earlier. So make sure that all of those requests are tailored for your individual audience, and when they ask, what can I do? You're asking for something that's reasonable that they can actually do.
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, we've found, you know, a member of Congress that we've identified who's going to introduce the bill for whatever the magical thing is we've decided we're going to do. And now our next ask is for the other 434 members to sign on to this bill. It's an easy ask. It's a very specific ask. So in terms of critiquing your message, so once you've written out your message, ask yourself these questions. Is your message inspiring? Is your message relevant to the person you're talking to? That takes us back again to thinking through their life experience, why they would want to hear this.
If your audience is not familiar with the issue, are you demonstrating how the problem will impact their community? So in your message, have you made it clear? Why should they care? Is your solution clear, accessible, and easy to grasp? And I know we keep going back to this. Not everything is clear and easy to grasp. We get that. But when you go in with the message, you really want to try to have something they can understand solution-wise. Is it logical? Does it make sense? And can it be repeated easily? So are you able to get that message out there easily? You know, we talk about having an elevator pitch, you know, the 2-minute message. That doesn't always lend itself so easily to these very difficult issues. But if you can hone in on what it is we want to do, like you said, if people need money to afford the places that we have identified as available to live in, get them the money. That's a pretty easy message, right? And how do we get them the money? We'll drill down on that. We'll have a bill that explains who can get the money, how to get the money, who it goes to. Does it go directly to the landlord or the owner of the building, or how does that all work? But the real message is, if people don't have enough money to live in a home and homes are available, we solve that problem by getting them the money. Right? That's an easy message. Avoiding common message traps. I think Hans touched on this a little bit. Jargon and acronyms. There's a lot of acronyms out there. You know, I can never keep HUD, FHLA, FHFA, FLHA, you know, Fannie and Freddie, I kind of know what they stand for. There's a lot of jargon and acronyms out there in our space. Avoid those if you can. Again, if you're talking to somebody in the housing space, if you're talking to somebody at HUD, sure, they get it. But most local elected officials do not live and breathe this stuff. Make it easy for them. Avoiding acronyms and jargon. Avoid giving too much information. You don't want to overload them. Again, it doesn't mean you shouldn't have the backup information. There shouldn't be a report that you can point to, that you can say, if you want to learn more about this, I think it's NHLC, I think it is, just came out with a report today. A recommendation, I just printed off, I'll bring it in. But you know, there are reports that we can point to. You don't have to read them chapter and verse of the report. Tell them where to find the report. Math problems, don't make it too hard to understand. And then again, if you have no story in your message, that doesn't usually help. It's good for people to get a story to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, the only thing I'll mention there too is, you know, when you look at message kind of traps, look at the inverse of that too. Recognize what you can control, what you can't control, because you may go into a meeting and that member of staff knows what you're going to ask for, and they're going to say, I would love to do that. I would definitely do that. If you can get the other side to do this, I'm totally on board. You have to recognize this is probably unreasonable. You have no control over that. And so I think you always need to be able to pivot back to what your request is and what you can't control and be part of. I just bring it up in the context of kind of message traps, because they go both ways.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question about message traps. So I think historically we've started from this place that like housing has homelessness, and we can just like all agree on that, and then we're trying to figure out why. I think what has felt different recently is that now we're having a discussion about whether housing and homelessness. I think that's what the Cicero bill is about. I think that's like, you've seen this in all the federal hearings on homelessness and housing that have happened in the last year. Like that is up for debate. And it reminds me of the debate over guns in this country. Like everything else solves gun violence in this country except gun control. It's mental health, it's domestic violence, it's all these other things. And that's the same trap I think we are in right now about housing, ending homelessness. And I'm just curious what you all think about how we get out of that trap, because it feels like one.
Eric?
Yes, it's, you know, it's never been easy. The way I really see it is that from 1941, 42, when Roosevelt came out with the second Bill of Rights, and created HUD to help implement that. We had this kind of social contract coming out of the Great Depression that we weren't going to let our fellow Americans be homeless. And that was never perfect. Obviously, there was redlining, discrimination, and then eventually the underfunding of public housing, which led to its deterioration, and the claim that it didn't work. But then that social contract was broken in 1980 with the Reagan Revolution, cutting HUD's budget in half. It was never made up at the federal level, was never made up at the state and local level. And so for the past 40 some years, we've been living with an inadequate amount of funding going to affordable housing. In the 1970s, we had a surplus of deeply affordable housing in this country. And we've just been losing year after year after year after year. And what we have now is kind of a situation as bad as the Great Depression, but yeah, it's like, the frog in the slowly boiling pot. We don't realize that we're there. We don't realize that we've gotten to that point. But for decades, from the 1940s up through the 1970s, families didn't become homeless. People who were elderly, got caught by the social net safety net. People who were disabled got caught by the social safety net. And people have forgotten that by now that ever actually existed. And so I think how do we get that message out that reminds people that this in fact is a man-made natural disaster, that this is a depression scale, climate, disaster scale event that has been caused, through policy choices, but we're so wrapped up in individual causes. And I just got a message from Sarah Sadian over at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I was looking for this earlier, but I couldn't find the transcript of Trump's remarks from his presidential announcement. But in it, he said, "We will end the scourge of homelessness that is plaguing our beleaguered Democrat-run cities and reestablish the principles of hard work and merit." So that's their message. Individual causes, Democrat policy failures, and not systemic causes, not housing. So, there was a period from, 2005-06 in the second Bush administration up through fairly recently, where at least at the federal level, there was broad support for housing first programs and people, on both sides of the aisle, never fully funded, but they at least agreed on the principle. Housing first has become a politically toxic term now, in the same way that like critical race theory is, because Tucker Carlson's on Fox News every day, hammering people. And so even Republicans who once supported it are now either backing off or being quiet. There's some good sign. The folks at the Low Income Housing Coalition have been doing a lot of meetings with federal congressional officials, and they've kind of backed that down a little bit. So they're just saying, now they're saying housing first and other solutions. So that we see the threat coming, we're responding, but no, that we have to get out that the cause is this lack of housing. It hasn't always been this way, and housing is the solution.
Yeah, I think part of that is also looking at examples. So, we have examples where that has been put into place and has worked. And so if you're able to say, well, look at this town where we provided housing and all of a sudden we have no one who is without a home. Imagine that. It's math, right? Like you got 10 people that are homeless and you provide 10 units for them at whatever, you meet them wherever their affordable limits are. And then we have 0 people who are homeless because they all got homes. And we're able to show by example, people like to see examples. And the other thing I like to do is take those examples, not necessarily the individuals who were now housed, but the people who would like credit for doing that. And let them go out and talk about their great work and how they solved the problem for their community. Give them a bigger platform, promote them so that way they are able to get credit, because they all like to get reelected. They all like credit. allow them to take the victory lap. I tackled homelessness in my hometown and I can do it in yours. I can do it statewide. I can do it nationwide. You know, but show them where it works. So come up with those actual stories. I think that, you know, my dad is a statistician and he will tell you, you can make statistics say anything you want them to say, right? So we're going to have our statistics. They're going to have their statistics. We're all going to say ours are right and theirs are wrong. But sometimes it's actually these stories, these small stories that are going to be more compelling, especially if the person telling that story is a voice that someone will listen to. So finding that, you know, moderate member or that, you know, the moderate Republican who solved the problem in his or her backyard to speak to others rather than finding the super ultra liberal person who solved the problem. Maybe they go on the road together. I don't know. But thinking through who's going to carry the message and what is the message, but it's clear that our message needs to be housing is what will solve the lack of housing problem.
Yeah, this seems like it goes back to your whole point about message development. And part of the message development is staying on message and recognizing what your message is and what your message is. One of the things, and Eric was pointing to this, is a lot of members as issues more change, start conflating different issues and they group issues together. Maybe they shouldn't be grouped together. And you know, the Trump quote that you just gave, obviously, said that because they're Democrat cities, that's what they call us, which that could play the issue, or because they funded the police. That's not the issue which you're there to talk about. You need to stay focused on your issue. You're not there to solve these other issues. And when there is, you know, an issue that's maybe lumped together inappropriately with the issue that you're there to talk about, I think you should ask them to kind of silo those issues. Say, no, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about this issue. I think we both agree that this is an issue that needs to be addressed and that's important. And I think that helps too. And you may not always get them to not tie those two issues together, but it's something that you should stay on point about.
I think you also can consider, again, what might move them, what are they interested in, if they're mostly interested in that economics argument. You know, it is really hard to find a job if you are homeless, if you don't have a mailing address, right? And so if you help people have somewhere to live, they may then in fact be able to get a job, which will then solve your perceived problem of people not getting jobs and therefore homeless. So try to tell them, actually, this will solve what you're seeing as the problem. We have to be careful, obviously, in our rhetoric, because we don't want to be saying people are lazy and don't have jobs and therefore that's why they're homeless. But if people had jobs, they would be less likely to be homeless. And if people were not homeless, they would be more likely to have jobs. So meet them there and spit it back to them. You want more people working? Give more people homes. Make it so they can go to work. Make it so their kids can go to school. It's very hard to get educated when you do not have a home to come home to. You do not have somewhere to do your homework. So if you want to break that cycle, if you're truly committed to it, work with us and turn it back to them. We don't want to buy into their racist, terrible rhetoric, but we've got to find a way to say, oh, you want this problem solved? This will help solve your problem. And again, it goes back to my very first point, which is how to get someone to do something you want them to do. Make them think they want to do it too.
I just like to suggest that the key is a livable wage, because majority of the homeless that in my area, in Miami, do work. But work is real if you can't afford one bedroom apartment, which you can't on the minimum wage in any county in the United States. So it's not just the work, it's the livable wage.
You're 100% right. And in fact, that brings me back to, even though I said statistics and numbers aren't always one of our best tools, but sometimes they are. So back when I was doing more affordable rental housing policy work, one of the things we used to point out was, you know, what an $8 an hour job would bring you in terms of, you know, monthly wages and what it costs to get a parking space in a garage in DC, because that's what you could afford.
Bring your frustration, that's all.
Yeah, and so helping people understand, like you said, you could be working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. You still can't afford housing. Well, how do we make up that gap? Okay, we've identified the problem. Now we're getting somewhere, right? We've identified that, no, we're not talking about people that don't have jobs. We're talking about people whose jobs don't pay them enough to afford the housing. Do we force the government to force, or do we have the government force employers to pay them more? Maybe. Or do we make the cost of housing come down? Do we fill that gap? And I think You're probably gonna have an easier fight filling the gap because we have experience doing that with vouchers or with lower rates of housing. You can't charge more than 30% of somebody's income, et cetera, et cetera. So we have more experience as a nation in that than driving wages up. Is it the right answer? I don't know, but it might be the easier answer. And it still gets us there if we can get people to buy into more vouchers, more housing, lower the rents, all of that.
One thing that I'm grappling with is kind of grappling through the conversation is, and thinking about the impact of race and all of this, like thinking back to during the Depression, like the homeless person was an older white man. And it's a lot easier, as Laurie Teacher talks about, it's a lot easier to like be able to empathize with someone when you feel like they look like you, they're like you. You're going to legislators, their constituents are going to be mostly like who votes, who are the people who are going to offer their face. And so I appreciate this. I appreciate this because these are really great tips about kind of like how you can have the messaging where it's like it's where, you know, it matters for you, it helps you. But it's like there's that aspect of race, like right now, like a lot of and brown people are homeless, like it's increasing. How do we navigate that piece? I just can't help but come back to that.
I think, you know, there's been a lot of great statistics shown about the disparate impact throughout the conference already. And one thing that we haven't talked about is that homelessness has a disparate impact on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and the majority of homeless people in most places are white, and both things are true at the same time. And things that you know, this is Heather McGee's point in the Sum of Us, that the use of racism to ruin public resources has harmed all of us. There used to be public swimming pools all across this country. They were forced to be integrated, and instead of integrating, we got rid of all the public swimming pools, and now none of us have them. Now we don't have public bathrooms anywhere, and it hurts all of us. It hurts, in particular, people experiencing homelessness, but pregnant people, older people, like, none of us get to enjoy that thing because racism ruined it for all of us, but it's harming all of us. And so bringing out the fact that, for example, in San Diego, the homeless people are arrested at 5 to 9 times the rate of white people experiencing homelessness for all these crimes experiencing of homelessness, crimes of homelessness, but the majority of people arrested are white. And so that's, both things are true at the same time. It has a disparate impact, and white people are also harmed too. And so we in order to fix this thing, we're fixing it for all of us, and it's not just a handout to one specific community. And that, if this elected official is a white person, you can say, the we in that, the assumed we is white people benefit from this too. That's, I think that's part of the answer there.
I mean, to the extent you can find somebody who looks like the person you're talking to come and speak and has lived that experience, that might be helpful too. So, because they may not notice it, see it, recognize it, but if you bring in a formerly homeless white person to say, I was homeless, that might open their eyes to it because they didn't notice it before. And some of that might be, where they are or their own experience. Maybe they don't see a lot of homelessness at all anyway. They just assume that it's going to be a majority of people of color. But if you bring someone in to say, no, that was me. So when you think, and it goes back to what we said before, think about your messengers. when you're testifying in front of a panel of, 6 white male Texas legislators, maybe having a white male formerly homeless person will be more effective. That doesn't mean we are taking voice away from other people, but we're looking at that. Maybe we put together a panel, so at least one. But if you're trying to figure out how to get through to people, it is important to think about who is bringing that message.
I have a comment, if that's okay. Two things. One, earlier when you were talking about, showing what the income was, right? Like who is living there, who is homeless. One of the things that, I've done in the last really years is encourage conversations with developers for community meetings is to encourage them to have a chart about who that is, right? So you think I'm talking about rapid rehousing families specifically. Well, who's gonna be living in that building? Your nurse, your child's teacher, and then it's like explaining, especially in my community in Santa Clara County, where last generation, you were easily able to buy a house in a medium income wage, and it's really impossible now to buy a house, period. So to really explain that those are our community members and they're not othering, so it makes us impact in community meetings that I think is important, and I don't see it used in them. So that's one thing. The other thing I was going to mention about this is that when I started at my current organization, I left direct service and went into communications. I'm a person with experience, I'm a person of indigenous descent, with immigrant parents and Salvadorian. My boss at the time was a white man from the South, right? The honest truth is, I understand the dynamics of the house. I'm gonna let him set it up so that the community meeting and the neighbors that we want are there. But the reality is we were a team and he was set it up for me. And when you first saw me in the community meetings, there I would see a shift, and I started empowering myself more about talking about my own lived experience, because we would grab people's attention with him being there, but the reality is that he was shifted over himself, right, with the messaging. So if you could find a team like that, because I also needed the door to be opened by this white guy from the South, right? So that's like, I think that's really effective. That would be my 2 cents about that.
Great thoughts.
Then I would, I think all those thoughts are great. I also think what Eric said about having the data available, that should resonate. I think another thing, probably the back of a lot of these members of staff mind is our partisan issues. This person coming to see for the same party. And to the extent that you can help mitigate that, I think it's helpful. So anytime there's a bipartisan issue, which it should be a bipartisan issue, I would always stress that bipartisanship, so you kind of take that component away from their thought process, because that, that is just part of it. Every issue that you deal with, whether it's this issue or any issue on capital or the state legislature, they're going to look at it through party lines.
In regards to the bipartisanship of the issue of housing, we know it should be, right? But it is very clear that there is one side that believes people should have housing because it's like what's good for humanity, and one side that maybe is getting more radical. And especially at the local levels, right? There is a noticeable shift in how radical maybe the right side has become about these things. Do you think there's, and this might be like nihilistic, but is it even worth trying to like engage at this point with how radical things are kind of becoming? Because when we have these conversations, I have noticed that it's like, there will be an immediate shutdown of like, that's some like woke liberal stuff, like whatever. It's like almost not even worth engaging, but it seems like that's what we have to do if this is actually going to, shift policy. I don't know if you guys, obviously you've dealt with that, I'm sure, as a professional lobbyist, so I don't know.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious on Hans's perspective on whether or not to speak to some of the further right, although Hans is not that far to my right, he's actually my left today. But back when I was doing more housing tax credit work, part of what I was brought on to do was to try to develop more Republican support for the housing tax credit. And what was amazing was that at that time, and this was in the early 2000s, there was not a question as to whether or not we should provide affordable housing. It was what was the best tool to provide it. And then somewhere, maybe 10 years into the 2000s, there began to be a shift. And we moved to that question, like you said, of, well, should we provide affordable housing? So it was no longer a question of like, or vouchers or HUD developments and CDBG money or housing tax credits. What's the best tool? It was, well, do we even need to do this? And that was really disheartening. And I found some really good allies in Republicans who understood some of these tools and understood the importance of them and what they've done to their communities, how they transformed their communities. And they became our spokespeople. And that's what you need to think about too, is are there people that the ones who maybe are a little more radical will listen to, who are closer to them than we are? So I'm not the one to go in now to make that point, but I can tap a Republican to do that. So Jack Kemp, for example, might have been someone who was understanding of these issues. Well, Paul Ryan worked for Jack Kemp. So do we get to Paul Ryan through that, right? He wasn't that radical on these issues. But, you know, thinking through who are the folks that are maybe closer to that side of the argument who can help us bring the message?
I think it's a great question. I think every legislator aspires to be effective, not just say no to everything. Unfortunately, that's not the dynamic that we're currently in, and a lot of more and more extreme candidates are being elected on both sides. It is an issue, though. You have to recognize when you go to these offices, where are they on this issue? Have they said no to everything? Have they made some very extreme comments? Maybe frankly, it's just not worth your time to engage that office. I'll also say, if you recognize it's not worth your time to engage that office, other legislators recognize that too. And they know which of their colleagues are effective, which ones they can work with and find a solution. Because at the end of the day, the compromise is not going to make either party probably entirely happy, but it is a compromise that moves the ball forward. When it comes to some of those maybe more partisan offices, the suggestion I have is what I said earlier in the presentation. It's find third-party validators that they know, that they trust, and that they rely on, they respect. And hopefully on this issue, there's a lot of those on both sides of the aisle that you can bring in there and recognize your audience and say, you know, I don't know if you heard, but X, Y, and Z is saying this is what they've done in, you know, Z state, this is what they're doing here at the federal level, this is who's supporting it. And I think that helps kind of temper some of those concerns. But I fully recognize what you're saying, and there are some offices that, you know, you'll probably be spinning your wheels with, and we deal with that here in Washington, D.C. when we frankly counsel clients, you know, it's probably not worth your time or effort to go there. Now, you don't want them just to hear from one side and kind of bolt of their position, but you know, if that's where they are, they're not, and they're, you know, intractable there, then I would just leave it alone.
My Board of County Supervisors had like a 5-hour meeting because they wanted to add when hiring city employees to consider diversity in hiring. And it was like, again, I'm not trying to be partisan, but it was like the far right people were just going ape shit about it. Like, so it's like you said, like, it's become like, should we even do housing? Like, why do we even care? Like, if they're that far away, it just seems like it's a really long way to reach.
But it also goes back to my point earlier, which is if you can find a way to convince them that we should do it because it actually meets their needs too. It's an economic issue. So should we do housing, or, you know, should we have the fire department called because someone is so cold that they can't move anymore? Well, maybe we should do housing. You know, like that trip to the ER is going to cost a lot more than putting them up in a motel. Like there are ways to do housing. There's short term, there's long term, there's things we can do. It's hard. We got to figure it out, but it's not cost effective to not do housing. And that's where some of these folks are. There are others who, like, the economics don't matter to me either. And they are, as you know, Hans said, just people we don't work with and people who their own colleagues don't work with. And, you know, that's okay. You're never going to get their vote. No one expects you to get their vote, and we can do things without their vote.
Yeah, the last thing I'd say on this is that one of the places where Housing First kind of saw its greatest success was in Salt Lake City, in, you know, the middle of one of the reddest states in the country, because you know, because the Mormon community there actually kind of took their Christian values seriously and, you know, said, we've got a homelessness problem and we as a state are going to do something about it. And yeah, as Mark was saying, this guy Lloyd Pendleton made the fiscal conservative argument for Housing First, and that was what carried a lot of people in Congress for a long time. Lloyd passed away. We've got Donald Trump undermining all of that today. So, you know, are we in a different place? Yes, but what can we learn from that? You know, the economic argument can be persuasive with some of the people who are actually, you know, true value, you know, conservative Republicans, as opposed to, just folks out on the extremes. Religious messengers, there are tons of people, obviously some of them are coming from a charity perspective rather than a justice perspective, and they may want criminalization, and many of the gospel missions, are there to proselytize, and they want people driven into their shelters by harsh conditions on the streets. So, they're not going to be realized, but there are, people doing homelessness work from a religious perspective who might be effective in messaging to a persuadable, Republican who, asserts that as part of their value statement. Again, we saw in Georgia that more evangelicals overwhelmingly voted for, Herschel Walker rather than a man who was like literally spent his entire adult life as, a preacher for the church. So, that's not going to work every time, but, you figure out which ones might be persuadable, you figure out what might persuade them, who might persuade them, and you work at it. And then, some of them you just leave to the side because they aren't going to be convinced. Yeah. On that note, our second word is advocate. And we are at time. So
We have one more question.
we have,
I'm trying to get quick. So thinking about the two extreme response policies you can have on 15 days plus. One is like just completely shutting you down. It's like not worth the time. The other end being they're like, yes, we love you, like we'll do everything you say. How do you evaluate whether you should keep going with a legislator? Like thinking of that, those ends. How do you evaluate whether to keep going with that particular legislator versus this will be wasting my time? Like, what are some points to consider when thinking about whether to continue with these advocacy tips with a particular group or legislator?
So you're asking how to consider whether or not to keep going forward with the one that loves you and wants to do everything you ask, or
Like,
the-
there's like a continuum of like responses.
Yeah.
One end is
Okay, got it. So one is like, I'm gonna introduce your bill and I'm gonna gather all my friends and we're gonna pass this tomorrow.
Yep.
And the other's like, no thanks, I disagree, and here's why. So, I think all the way up to maybe stopping at the no thanks, I absolutely disagree and will never be on board person. Because everyone up until that person, I think is gettable. You don't need them all, and that's another calculation you might do. You might look at, well, how many do I need? Which are the key ones I need? Sometimes it's not numbers, it's quality, not quantity. Is it the chair and the ranking member of the committee? Is it someone with a lot of influence? Is it the person who's running for the next level and they're going to talk about my issue? Is it someone who's effective? So talking about that person that loves you and wants to do everything you want, but that person doesn't know what they're doing. They're not effective. They're not really liked by their colleagues. Maybe you find a way to give them a role, but not have to be your top champion. So you have to think about that too. Is it's a wonderful problem to have when you've got too many members that want to help you, but you do have to figure out what's the role for each one. You don't want anyone to walk away with hard feelings. I tried to help these people and they wouldn't help me. That's not good either. But sometimes you got to evaluate, who's going to be the most helpful. And as Hans said, sometimes you got to say, I think we can walk away from this person.
Listen, I think that's a really sophisticated question, and I think Francine gave a good perspective. And at the end of the day, you are going to have extremes on any type of issue for the most part. It's those that are going to be finding that compromise. And someone mentioned gun control earlier in the conversation, and we look at the piece of legislation that just passed, and you had extremes that wanted nothing, and you had extremes that wanted everything, and a little bit happened in between. And so you want to go to those members that are going to be part of that conversation. And at the end of the day, you're going to recognize who those members are. It's typically not a huge universe. They may not always sit on the committees, but a lot of times they do. They have some sort of position of leverage with those different kind of back and forth the issues. So that's not a long way of saying, don't disregard those that are super helpful and want to help you and have the energy and they're excited. Maybe they're good members. Maybe they're going to grow into those positions. I think those are things you want to continue to support, cultivate, stay on the board, resource moving forward. But when things get a little bit closer to any kind of real arena happening, you certainly want to be in the ring. You don't want to be one of the extremes. That's it about that.
and the last thing is like with everybody but the totally unpersuadable ones, sometimes the victory isn't that they support you, but that they don't oppose you. And so, maybe you don't see it up until, they aren't a vote for your thing, but they don't block it when they're the committee chair from coming to the floor. So, there's value in that. You never know what that value is going to be until it happens. And it may be 10 years in the future. But so, unless you just know you're not my friend. Keep going to those. Yeah.
But maybe do your research beforehand, because you don't want to tip your hand and tell them what you're planning to do if you know they're going to use it against you too. I mean, this is really serious. You should know who you're going to see before you see them. Sometimes you can be blindsided by somebody who really doesn't like your issue, and you're like, oh, I wish I hadn't told them we were going to introduce this bill because they're going to tell their colleagues to stop it. But you can do some research beforehand and get a pretty good sense of who do I want to tip off, who do I want to try to bring on board. And again, going back to that sort of sequencing and timeline, we can't always control what's going to happen, but we can control what we do and who we tell first, how we want to pursue these things. Understanding, what needs to be done to get across the finish line. So doing your homework is really important. I think that's my big takeaway. Do some research. There's a lot of information out there, maybe too much, but do your research because it will help you.
And last but not least, folks like Francine and Hans are available on pro bono basis. Not all the time.
All the time.
All the time. Francine will do whatever you need. But come to the National Law Center. This is what we do. We are the law center, the hub of this national movement to end homelessness. And if you need a lobbyist to consult with you on this, to do that research with you, we can try to make that happen. So this conversation was not what I was initially expecting, and I love it. But we're going to go out and we're going to make housing a human right, despite some people thinking that it's not the best idea all the time.
I think it's a great idea. You just try to talk Trump supporters into it.
Right. But we're going to take a 10-minute break and we'll come back to wrap things up. So thank you, everyone.
I like the no words. You want to be in the room. I've learned.
Great.
I can think everything I want.